Hey, welcome. On behalf of GW Law's Environmental and Energy Law program, I'm delighted to welcome our audience for tuning in today, and and especially to welcome our guests, GW Law alumni Jill Gocher and Lauren Caliendo. My name is Dawn Atanasio. I lead the program in energy law here at GW. Before turning to more in-depth introductions and to today's program, I just want to remind you that this is the second in a series of career discussions. We have programs scheduled for the next 3 Fridays. Next week on February 25th, we'll be talking to 2 young attorneys, one who's working at FERC and one in private practice. So we'll contrast government practice to private practice. On March 4th and 11th, we'll have a little bit of a change in format. We will be having programs both at 12 noon and at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, so double headers. On the 4th, we'll be addressing at noon, we'll be talking about ESG practice. And in the later afternoon at 3 p.m., we'll be talking to 2 alums who are at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, part of the Department of Interior. Then the following week, we will have our program on energy law in the C-suite. We'll be talking about law and business in the corporate executive suite. And then later that day, we will be talking to Adrienne Clare, an attorney in private practice, she and I will just be exploring all the many facets of law that energy lawyers tend to get themselves into. We'll take a break on March 18th. That will be our annual Shapiro conference here at GW. I hope you'll all tune into that. There'll be separate publicity about that. And then we'll be finishing out the session on March 25th with a couple of programs that I'm still working on. We will be taping these interviews. They'll be available online. However, in this live session, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. Type your questions into the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring that. Don't use the chat function, use the Q&A function. And we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. At the end of the program, I will do a little sign off so that we will know where to end our tape for the taped version. But if you want to stay around, and if we haven't gotten to your question, our guests have graciously agreed to stay around for a little longer and try to answer any questions that are still remaining. So with that, today, it's my pleasure to welcome 2 of my former students. They're now both assistant general counsels in their respective states. Jill Gocher, who graduated in 2018, currently serves as Assistant Attorney General for the Oregon Department of Justice. Her client is the Oregon Public Utility Commission, and her work includes advising on energy rate cases, transportation electrification, water regulation, and telecom issues. Prior to working at the DOJ, she was Senior Analyst with the Oregon Public Utility Commission. And she also worked as the WECC Enforcement Counsel at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation in Washington, D.C., right out of law school. Lauren Caliendo is class of 16. She is an Assistant Attorney General in the Colorado Attorney General's Office in the Public Utility Litigation Unit. Before transitioning to energy work, Lauren served in the Colorado Attorney General Office's Opioid Unit, litigating against opioid manufacturers and distributors for their alleged role in the opioid epidemic. There's a lot of vowels in that. Laura is a native of Colorado. She enjoys backpacking, snowboarding, bread baking, and we are talking about she plans to go snowboarding this weekend, and we'll talk a little bit about the differences that utilities versus recreationists have towards snow. So welcome, Lauren and Jill.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
So Jill, I want to start with you with the first question. You're both, of course, with the Attorney General's offices of your states, but you serve as an attorney for the state's Public Utility Commission. So Jill, starting again with you, let's talk about how that works.
Sure. So it's a really interesting way that we've had the DOJ's relationship with the PUC structured in Oregon. So with very limited exceptions in the state of Oregon, all legal counsel for our state agencies has to be provided by the Department of Justice. And so that means that we essentially act as in-house counsel for our client agencies. So I serve commission staff along with my 4 other assistant attorney general counterparts. And then our assistant attorney general in charge, so like our manager, our boss, serves the commissioners. So he's commission counsel, we are commission staff counsel. And as in-house, we get to do a whole breadth of fun things. We work on both contested or litigated cases before the commission. So that involves like what you would think of traditional litigation, like filing briefs, evidentiary support, helping staff with testimony. And so that's a really interesting component. And the commission is required to base all of their decisions in contested cases or like litigated cases, which I know Lauren will talk about, just on the record before the commission. And then we also support staff with rulemaking. So when the legislature designates us some legislative powers, we have the authority to promulgate rules. So we support staff with that as well. And then we also do just open meeting public policy work as well, so non-contested cases. So it's kind of a whole gambit of things that we get to work on with our
So you're both advisory staff and litigation staff. You cover both aspects of the.
Yeah, so we represent the state of Oregon. So we give legal advice on the behalf of the state of Oregon to the Oregon Public Utility Commission on everything they do.
We might want to come back to that in a minute, but let's talk for a minute with Lauren. Tell us how that works in Colorado.
Sure. So we're set up a little bit different from the way Jill and her team are set up. So I represent trial staff of the commission. And so the commission has staff, just like Oregon does, which are economists, engineers, accountants, other professionals that advise the commission on cases and proceedings before the commission. And within staff are two different segments. There's advisory staff that directly advise the commissioners and serve in more of like a counsel and general counsel role. And then there's trial staff. And trial staff litigate in cases in front of the commission. And so my team, we only represent trial staff, and so we only do litigation. There is another team in the Attorney General's office that represents advisory staff, and they do more rulemaking, they do more general counsel type work. And then within our office as well, we have the utility consumer advocate team that represent consumer interests. And then there's another team within our office that's in the natural resources that represents the Colorado Energy Office, which represent the governor's interests in cases in front of the commission. So there's lots of different units within our office that practice in front of the commission, but with different clients and different roles.
Oh, Donna, I think you're muted still.
I was. So Jill, going back to you, how does that work in terms of consumer representation before your commission?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to hear Lauren describe that because it's just not people that work for the state that represent consumers, which is really fascinating. And so we have actually a consumer representative called the Citizens Utility Board, CUB is the acronym, and they are very involved in our proceedings. And for our contested cases, there's the ability to intervene in the contested case. And so then you can participate and represent your interests. And so we have like the Small Business Utility Association. Sometimes we have like Walmart and Kroger participate in big rate cases where it would affect their customers. We have the Northwest Energy Coalition, and they represent like a different subsect of consumers. And so really, we just have a pretty open process for anyone that wants to participate and represent their group, but obviously primarily consumers is what we see a lot in most of our cases. They can intervene in the process. And to participate in the policy work, like for example, we're doing a rulemaking on transportation electrification right now, you don't need to formally intervene. Like you can just come to public workshops and represent your interest and have open discussions. It's really transparent in my opinion. And then that's contrasted with the work that Lauren does, where it's more like contested, like litigation, and that is more of a like formal quasi-judicial process with an administrative law judge moderating. So as the DOJ, we're only representing commission staff in my role.
And Lauren, in your state, again, you have all these other representatives. Do you also have those interveners coming in and representing the other diverse interests?
We do. So we have a lot of the same interveners that Jill does. We've got like Walmart will appear sometimes, other large companies, Tesla, a lot of NGOs like Western Resource Advocates, Sierra Club, and then other private interests like ChargePoint or other charging companies appear in our proceedings frequently, as well as representation for independent power producers, and other coalitions representing private energy interests.
So let's jump into why all these people are interested. What's the substance of what you're doing? What's your hottest issue right now, Lauren?
Ooh, our hottest issue right now. So one of our cases that went to hearing in December, but is still before the commission, was Xcel Energy's electric resource plan. And Xcel Energy is the large utility that covers most of Colorado. And their electric resource plan was one of the, probably the biggest case I've ever had in my tenure here. But it involves how is the utility going to get their energy for the foreseeable future. So that's, decommissioning coal plants to meet climate emission targets. That's building wind and solar resources. That's building transmission to support those resources. And so it was an extremely complex case. There were dozens of intervenors and thousands of pages of testimony and attachments. And it's a very high profile case because that is going to dictate Colorado's energy future and also how we are going to achieve our climate targets between now and 2050. So it was a very, very cool case, very, very exciting and interesting.
That's really interesting because you're right here at the cusp of energy and climate change. Certainly, utilities are one of the concerns. They're also one of the solutions. And so you're having this ability to operate in that space, which I just find really interesting. Jill, how about you? Why don't we stay on that theme for a minute? What's happening in terms of climate change and utilities in Oregon?
I mean, I think all of the issues that Lauren mentioned are exactly the same ones that we're looking at now. And it's really interesting to see how similar our states are in approaching it, because it is the pressing issue of our time. And so we have a similar process for electric and natural gas utilities, and we call it an integrated resource plan. But it's the same thing where it's like a 20-year planning horizon, talking about, the coal plants in Wyoming being decommissioned and where are we going to find wind. And we actually are starting to explore offshore energy. So it'll be interesting. I will definitely be tuning into the BOEM discussion as well. So we just went through the BOEM process of figuring out the leasing rights for offshore here in Oregon, and just exploring what that looks like. And so we're facing all those same issues, as well as resiliency, wildfire response, weather, emergency deferrals, you name it. But one thing that I'm working on that is really interesting, and I know when Lauren and I started talking, it was so fascinating to see how many players we knew in common, and B, just the same issues we're facing. And so we have a new legislative mandate that was handed down by the legislature in session last year, to really change how utilities are investing in transportation electrification. And so in response, staff decided to kick off a rulemaking to kind of put structure around this investment. And so we are in the informal stage of rulemaking right now. And what that means is we are essentially coming up with, very rough draft rules, having workshops with some of the players Lauren mentioned, like ChargePoint, Tesla, the utilities, our consumer advocates, our renewable advocates, our equity advocates, and just having a discussion on how to draft these rules together. And then that will kick into the formal rulemaking process that I'm sure all of people that have taken administrative law are way too familiar with. And so that's been really interesting because we're trying to strike that balance, representing staff, between protecting customers, right, making sure their rates don't get too high from this new capital investment, but also trying to accelerate the adoption and infrastructure around transportation electrification. And it's a very interesting line to walk, because the commission looks at both issues, right? So it's been really interesting.
And Lauren, you've been doing some work in the same field. I think actually you're a little ahead.
We are. Yeah, we did. We wrapped. So Xcel Energy, which is, as I said, one of the major utilities, and also Black Hills Energy in Southern Colorado, both were required by law passed in 2018 to file transportation electrification plans. And it was plans for how the utilities were going to build and support the governor's goal for 1 million electric vehicles on the roads by 2030. And so to achieve that goal, of course, we need the infrastructure to support that many electric vehicles. So it's building transmission and distribution, building charging stations, the rate structure for those charging stations, ensuring that there's energy to support electrification of transportation, and also public interest, things like electrifying school buses and providing low-income programs. And it was the first TEP was filed in 2020. It was a very, very fun case, but also very contentious case. We have another one due to be filed next year, which I can't believe it's already coming because I feel like we just finished the other one. But so the electrified transportation feature is here, and it's very cool to be part of it.
And that is sort of interesting that some of these same issues do keep coming back because they have to keep being renewed as things change. For example, reliability plans, et cetera. And speaking of reliability, of course, let's talk about snow. Snow and rates, two things that most people don't think happen in the same sentence. But Lauren, I think you've got some interesting insights on this.
We do. So as many people will recall from exactly a year ago this weekend, President's Day weekend, there was a major storm, Winter Storm Uri, that affected most of the country, but particularly in Texas, where the Texas electric grid failed. And millions of people were without power, without water. And while that seemed to be mostly just an issue in Texas, because as many people know, Texas is on its own grid, it did impact utilities all around the country. And utilities in Colorado saw enormous natural gas price spikes for those 5 or so days over the President's Day weekend last year. And because of the extremely cold temperatures, the demand was extraordinary and the prices were extraordinary. Some of our utilities spent enormous portions of their annual budget in only a few days. And so the Public Utility Commission in Colorado ordered all of the utilities to carve out those costs from that weekend and set them aside for review in a separate cost recovery proceeding so that they wouldn't just automatically be rolled in to consumer rates and people would be hit with enormous bills. So we had 6 cases that came out of that were all happening at the exact same time. And it was just a ton of work over the last year litigating these 6 cases. But we came to resolutions in all of them dealing with cost recovery, protecting low-income consumers from rate spikes, and also a lot of forward-looking things to prevent something like this happening again in the future. So conservation messaging, some consideration of resilience or using different like dual fuel units, things like that to prevent natural gas spikes and to mitigate costs for consumers if something like this were to happen again. And seeing cold temperatures next week again here, we're a little nervous, but I think we're going to be okay. We learned a lot from last year.
Jill, how do those issues play in your state?
It's pretty much the same thing going on in Oregon. It's very similar, where we had a huge ice storm that affected a massive part of Portland, which is served by both of our major utilities, Portland General Electric and Pacific Power. So it's very similar conversations that have been happening as well about carving out, the money that utilities are using to respond to these events, which takes a tremendous amount of manpower, and line people are out there working so hard to restore service. And so it's important to discuss that treatment and that rate impact. And then also wildfires have been a pretty serious issue in Oregon as well. I know they are in Colorado, and we've had just some pretty severe outage results from that, to the extent that the legislature directed us to do a whole wildfire temporary rulemaking. So that completed last year. And then we also, for the first time, have one of our utilities doing public safety power shutoffs to try to prevent wildfires from happening. So yeah, we're really seeing the effects of climate change and really seeing how we have to adapt, both for rate making treatment and also just to make the public more safe and make sure they have power when this is going on.
I'd like to switch over to Lauren. Before I do that, just let me remind students that if you do have questions, put them into the Q&A chat and we'll be turning to those. Lauren, wildfires, Colorado?
Oh,
Want to
no,
talk about that?
never. In the past 3 or 4 years, it's, been really significant in Colorado that from June to September, off my back porch, I can't even see the mountains because of all the wildfire smoke. And it's kind of become the normal course of business, unfortunately, that wildfires are just a reality of climate change in Colorado and in the West. And I've had at least one wildfire mitigation proceeding that we litigated, and that dealt with, doing a lot of work around power lines to, clear trees and prevent from storms or trees falling into the lines. And also just addressing resiliency of the grid itself if a wildfire does break out. And it's going to continue to be an issue in Colorado. And yeah, unfortunately, we will continue to see this coming before the commission and also all over the state as we deal with wildfire.
So the two of you are really, so the two of you are really at the cusp of environmental and energy law as well, climate change, and yet you've got this big component of rates, of understanding the electric system, of understanding, I presume, gas utilities and other. I know that Jill certainly has telecom in her portfolio as well as water. So you've got all this sort of mix of knowledge. Thinking back to law school, what could you have done to prepare yourself? Well, what did you do to prepare yourself, and what could you have done to have prepared yourself better?
You want to take this one, Lauren?
Sure. Well, the obvious answer is to take courses with Professor Atanasio.
Yes.
Of course, yes.
But let's put that aside.
Yes. So I think, and Jill, I'm sure you agree with this, the learning curve for what we do is extremely steep. It's very technical work. The experts that we work with are incredibly knowledgeable, and across the board, lawyers are definitely not the smartest person in the room in everything that we do. And so in law school, we took energy courses, and that was very helpful to have a base of knowledge, to know the lingo, to know what we're talking about, to know the science and the basics of how energy works in the United States and energy regulation and the history of it. And that foundational knowledge is critical to being able to understand and work your way through the bigger issues in practice. So certainly taking as many energy law courses as possible. And I think a really helpful approach too is joining something like the Energy Bar Association and attending events where it's kind of a mix of law and industry, where you can learn about the industry also through the lens of a legal perspective, but also get insight into other industry events outside of the law. Because having a technical basis is critical for practicing law, because you got to know at least a little bit about what you're talking about, got to know some of the acronyms.
Yeah, I agree with everything Lauren said. And I will say that at least when I was transitioning from doing federal energy practice back to doing state energy practice. And although like you can hear, like Lauren and I states are working on very similar issues, the things that we call them are completely different. And the process that our states have to approach them are completely different. And so I think if you're interested in working for a state or federal like agency in any way, just understanding like the people to talk to, the people to learn from, the people to network with, to really figure out what type of work they want to be doing, what type of issues you want to be working on is super critical. Because the beautiful thing about being an energy practitioner is that you're constantly learning. Like I knew nothing about utility accounting. And that's like 90% of my work right now, because I did both like a really big deferral case, but also I'm doing like 2 major rate cases. And so I was like, I don't really know how to do deferred accounting. I need to learn this really fast. And luckily we do have staff that can serve as an expert to get you up to speed, as well as just the amazing attorneys I also work with. And so I think just being super curious, both in law school and in the early parts of your practice, is critical. Like doing as many internships as you can, like talking to as many people as you can. Most state commissions have internships. Like I got into the state world by working as staff, and you don't, like, just because you have a law degree doesn't mean you need to start out specifically practicing. Like, that's something I did 2 years after working as staff. And that has really helped me in my role, because I know how that my client agency works, and what, all the words mean and that sort of thing. So that's what I would say. It's really helpful.
You both mentioned networking. How do you build that network?
So we're very fortunate that the energy bar is very small, and everybody knows everybody else, and it's a great world to be in, because there are just some extraordinary lawyers that practice energy law around the country. I think, joining the bar association, like in Colorado, the Rocky Mountain chapter, the energy bar is very active, and puts on some really fantastic events, which plug for our March 3rd Winter Energizer on regional markets. It will be excellent. And, I think the Bar Association is a great way to meet people. And also through alumni associations, which is how I met Jill. And I think just putting yourself out there and, not being afraid to reach out to people, like, if any of the students watching this want to reach out to Jill or I, would be happy to talk about what we do and some of the other players in our worlds. So I think just, putting yourself out there is a great way to meet people.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, I would just add here that the Energy Bar Association does certainly welcome student members. They have a reduced rate for students, so if you're not already a member, it's a great thing. As a former president of the Energy Bar Association, I feel obligated to say that it's a great supportive group. But there's also the ABA SEER, the section on environment, energy, and natural resources. They also offer some great programming. Your local bar chapter, that is, if you're a member of the state bar of whatever, or the DC bar, there are sections that deal with it. So I do urge students to get involved in those organizations because it's a really important place to be.
Yeah, and I would sorry, Dawn, before you move on, I
No,
do think those, like Lauren said, the state bars in the energy sector, like even federally, I know the three of us know so many of the same people just from our different areas of practice, which is remarkable. I think, we're in such different parts of the country. But I will say that if you do end up joining like a state energy bar or even like attending some of the things as a student, you really get to understand the players, which then lets you understand the job opportunities because you know where to look. And sometimes that can be kind of difficult to figure out. So I think it's good for that as well. And don't be afraid to like message people on LinkedIn and send them emails. Like when I was looking to move out to Oregon, I think I emailed every single person on the EBA email list that practiced in Oregon or Washington and just asked them for a phone call. And it's how I got my first job out here. So I think it's a very underrated way to engage.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that too, like if somebody that maybe like Jill or I's, what we do is not necessarily what you're interested in. We also know, again, because the bar is so small, everybody else that represents all the other interests. So if you're like, hey, I think working for an NGO like Western Resource Advocates is more in my interest area, we know somebody and we can connect you with them. And so again, the bar is so small, everybody knows everybody. And so just making those connections is really important.
Absolutely. And it is super collegial too. It's like, yes. I'm super friendly with everyone that appears before the commission. And so
yes, we are totally spoiled that way.
Yes, we really are.
Yeah,
it's friendly litigation. Yeah,
it is
file.
Yeah, usually.
Yes.
but that is an important point because these are people that you build coalitions with as well as whom you litigate with, and so I think that's kind of universal. It's a small universe. Certainly in other states, I've seen some of the same people. First they're working for a utility, then they're working for an advocacy organization, then they're at the Public Utility Commission. They change places often because it is a small community, and depending on where your interests are, if it's transportation electrification, maybe that's something you're doing here now, but maybe there's another organization you want to do it with next year. Yeah. So again, for students, I would definitely encourage that. I don't think let's see. Oh yes, we do have a question here. In your states, are either of you seeing an increase of smaller distributed generation resources and subsequent interconnection upgrade and/or capacity issues for the grid?
Yes.
Short answer, yes.
Any further comment on that?
Yeah, we had, so this is something I worked on when I was staff for the commission. So I was leading, we have a program called the Community Solar Program here. And so it's a legislatively mandated program for small distributed energy resources. And it's a subscriber model. So it's like, you have, I think it's a 2 megawatt limit, and you can put it anywhere in the state. And then you can have subscribers that subscribe to your energy anywhere from the state. And then it's an on-bill credit system. So it's really interesting. We had some really fascinating interconnection issues come up because at the time, Pacific Power had, I think, a 10-year study lag on their interconnection queue. And so no community solar projects would have been able to come in because they were stuck behind all these massive PURPA projects that weren't getting studied. And so it was like, I knew nothing about interconnection going into the role, and it was just like a masterclass on this. And so we ended up we found a workaround by doing a community solar specific queue, while the utility was also pursuing queue reform with FERC, that ended up getting approved. And so, I mean, it's such a huge issue because now you have you have generation popping up in, I mean, Oregon's super rural. It's like we have I-5 corridor has a bunch of people, but everywhere else you really don't have a lot of people. And so if you have generation happening somewhere that there was no generation before, it presents some pretty massive upgrade costs. And who pays for that? Because it's going to kill a small project. It gets like a, $600,000 upgrade bill. So it's been really fascinating.
Yeah, we had a lot of similar issues in the electric resource plan that we just is still waiting a decision, but that we had hearing on. That was a major issue in that proceeding, right? Because that proceeding encompasses all generation and distribution and transmission. Going alongside of that proceeding, though, we had another case that was the Colorado Power Pathways, which was a major transmission upgrade to enable greater renewable resource acquisition to meet these climate targets in different parts of the state. And that case was in the billions of dollars. And we, some of the issues that came up were accessing parts of the state that don't have sufficient transmission or distribution in order to access those resources that are available there. So yes, very, very relevant issue and ongoing issue in Colorado.
We do need to wrap up because we're almost out of time, but that question came from Kelsey, who's now practicing before the Maine Public Utility Commission. So I think at this point we've covered both coasts, as well as the middle of the country, and we can see that there's a lot of similarities that are appearing. So I want to thank both of you so much for doing this. It's really just so much fun to come back and talk with both of you and to see I learn so much from you now because of what you're doing and understanding what's happening in your states. So thank you very much for those who are attending. Tell your friends, this will get posted. They can come back and listen, and do come and join us next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.